Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Ng. I'm on the Authors at Google team here at Google Los Angeles. It's my pleasure today to welcome Gustavo Arellano to our campus today to talk about his new book, Taco USA: How Mexican Food Conquered America. Gustavo is the editor of OC Weekly, an alternative newspaper in Orange County, California, and he's the author of Orange County, A Personal History, a frequent commentator for LA Times and Marketplace, and a lecturer with the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department at Cal State Fullerton. Gustavo also writes the very popular and nationally syndicated column Ask a Mexican, in which he answers any and all questions about America's spiciest and largest minority. This award-winning column has a weekly circulation of over 2 million in 39 newspapers across the US and was published in book form in May 2007. Gustavo is a lifelong resident of Orange County and is the proud son of 2 Mexican immigrants, one of whom was illegal. Please help me welcome Gustavo Arellano.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. I would first like to thank you for all the contributions you've made to the understanding of the Mexican culture, and and the format that you put it in is just really unique and special. So
thank you. I appreciate it.
One of the first questions we have is why have so many Mexican foods like chili and salsa and tacos, of course, been turned into a national and international moneymaker, and yet, from an outsider's view, not a lot of that money is being filtered back into Mexico. What are your thoughts on that?
The book, Taco USA, I addressed that. There's this misconception that it's only, rapacious Americans who are making all this money on Mexican food or Mexican foodstuffs like tequila, like hot sauce, tortillas, Fritos, Doritos, and all these different things. But that's not necessarily true. What happens is when it comes to food or the production of food, it's a business, and business is capitalism. Capitalism is rapacious. So in the book, you have everyone ripping everyone off. Mexicans ripping off Mexicans, Americans ripping off Mexicans, Mexicans ripping off Americans, Koreans coming in and ripping off Mexicans, Mexicans coming in and ripping off Koreans. And when I first started doing this book, part of me, you have that sort of jingoistic thing like, no person other than a Mexican can make Mexican food. Everything else is fake. But that's not the case. Food is food is food. I think what matters ultimately is the food's good. After that, you cannot ding someone for ripping somebody else off. They'll get theirs in the afterlife, but here in the terrestrial world, they would do it too. One example that I had was Taco Bell. We all know what Taco Bell is, of course. They got Glenn Bell, the founder of Taco Bell. He got his idea for making these tacos from a restaurant in San Bernardino that still exists, Mitla Cafe. It's on the corner of Mount Vernon and 6th Street, now celebrating in San Bernardino, celebrating its 75th anniversary. So that kind of sucks. Okay, that's fine. But then at the same time, I also interviewed the founder of El Torito, Larry Cano, who's a Mexican guy, and he admitted to me his business strategy was he would tell his trusted employees, okay, you're going to find Mexican restaurants across the United States that are popular. You're going to get a job at those restaurants. You're going to work there for a month. You're going to steal all their secrets. Then you're going to get fired. And then you're going to come back to me, and we're going to rip them off. So, it goes both ways.
Nice. That's great. Also in Taco USA, you talk about the history of Mexican food in the United States and its evolution, everywhere from, the tamale man to the chili queens to Taco Bell and Tex-Mex food that you were saying. What are your thoughts on authenticity and how people really kind of portray that, theirs is authentic, and yet they're doing it here in the United States. So how authentic could it be?
Exactly. When it comes to food, there's always going to be that question of authenticity. What is authentic? What is it? And the funny thing is, most people, they really do care about that question, and they're incredibly passionate about it. I was one of those people. Again, before I started doing this book, I was one of those people that there's real Mexican food and then there's fake Mexican food. But as I started doing the research for the book, took me about 2 years, well, a lifetime of eating Mexican food with 2 years of actual intense research via eating Mexican food all across the United States. It quickly dawned on me that people's idea of what quote unquote Mexican food is completely different, yet at the same time, everyone assumed that their Mexican food was not only the authentic version, but the version that everyone else ate. I'll give you an example. I travel a lot to Denver. Denver is one of my favorite cities to travel. It's just a great atmosphere. So over there, the Mexican food is absolutely crazy. Chile rellenos, which we all know what they are. Here in Southern California, there's stuffed chilies with cheese, and you fry them in egg batter, and voila, there you have it. In Denver, you have that, but instead of white cheese, it's yellow cheese. Instead of like the big Anaheim chilies that we use, they're smaller, squatter chilies from Southern Colorado. They put the egg batter, sure, but then on top of that, they wrap it in a wonton skin, then fry it, and there's your chile relleno. That's one dish. A much crazier dish is something called the Mexican hamburger. A Mexican hamburger is a burrito of beans and chicharrones, pork rinds, with a hamburger patty right in the middle. And then they serve it to you on a dish, and they cover it in chili gravy. And there, we would call it a wet burrito. Over there, they call it a smothered burrito. And it's covered in this chili gravy that is orange, bright orange, because of the Broncos. They love the Broncos so much. It is an amazing dish. It is an absolutely amazing dish. Yet it exists nowhere else in the United States. So when I first found out about the Mexican hamburger, I asked them, what's a Mexican hamburger? They would look at me, they're like, you mean you don't have them in Southern California? I'm like, no, guys, you guys only have it in Denver. And then they got really sad about that. They're like, oh, we thought everyone knew what a Mexican hamburger was. So you go all across the United States, and everyone has this idea of what's authentic and what's not. So ultimately, we're reduced to having to acknowledge that there is no such thing as authentic Mexican food. It's authentic if you say it's authentic, but really it's not authentic. It's like this existential morass that we should never really get out of. Ultimately, what matters is the food good? And if it's good, good for you. And the great thing, though, about, so all this said, that question of authenticity is what's driven American consumption of Mexican food. There's always been, in the mind of Americans, they've always known that the Mexican food in front of them, it's great, but that there's better Mexican food somewhere down the path. That's been the course of Mexican food in this country for over 125 years. Starting with tamales, going with what we now know as just chili in a can, used to be called chile con carne, going through Taco Bell. At one point, people thought Taco Bell was, quote unquote, authentic Mexican food, or the most authentic food you could find. And of course, every decade, there's a new Mexican food stuff that comes in to be the new authentic Mexican food. In the 80s, it was fajitas. Now fajitas are as American as Doritos.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I've noticed a lot in, a lot of the Carl's Jr. commercials and some of the brands that are out there now, that the Chipotle chili is like the end all to to chilies, and and that one is just really, it's got a great smoky flavor, but as far as depth of flavor compared to all the other chilies and like guajillo and cascabel and all that,
yeah.
Where is it ignorance on their part, or is it just lack of experimentation? What is your thought on that?
I don't think it's ignorance so much as they just haven't been exposed to it. And of course, I guess that's ignorance in a way, where if there's something in front of you and you don't know it, that's ignorant. But at the same time, as you know, with foods, there are different trends that come in. There's different trends that fall in and out of flavor. So for the longest time, the only chili that Americans knew, the first quote-unquote chili that Americans knew that came from Mexico was the Tabasco pepper that they would eat in their Tabasco hot sauce. Then it became chili powder, just chili powder, created from, was it Tabasco peppers? I don't think it was Tabasco peppers, other peppers from northern Mexico. Then it became hot sauce. That's for them, was their conception of peppers. Oh, and then of course, just chili peppers from New Mexico, which we now know as the Ortega pepper or the Anaheim chili, that came from New Mexico. So these were all different traditions that would come into the United States. Then of course the jalapeno comes in. Once nachos became popular in the 1970s, all of a sudden people are eating jalapenos. Then chipotle, the chipotle pepper, not the chipotle burrito chain, that really kicked in the late 1990s and so forth. But now you're starting to see other peppers come in. The habanero, people are starting to realize what habaneros are. You're having these habanero eating contests. Google YouTube, there's this great clip of this I think it's 13-year-old boy is like, I'm gonna eat a habanero, and he bites into it full on, and then within 20 seconds, his face turns crimson. He's like, ah. Well, typical teenager going, but people are realizing that. Did these peppers become invented in those decades? Of course not. They've always existed in the United States. One big thing, though, that has happened is those peppers come up along with Mexicans, or rather, get into the mainstream. So the chipotle pepper, its most its most famous use is around central Mexico with Poblano cuisine, Chilango cuisine, food from Mexico City. Those traditions really didn't penetrate the mainstream of the United States until really the 1970s and 80s with Rick Bayless and Diana Kennedy and other chefs, and here in Southern California, or just here in Santa Monica actually, the two hot tamales, but they really didn't explode into the American consciousness until the Chipotle burrito chain, which interestingly enough really doesn't use chipotles.
Right. Yeah, and that's going to lead me to my next question. You talk about the hot sauces and salsas in modern day cuisine, and what is and the habanero. We were talking about at what point does burn your insides out, and look how much heat I can take, supersede the flavor and the balance of a well balanced salsa.
Exactly. Americans have been. The world has always been enticed by heat, by spices. That's what made Columbus, so they told me in elementary school, sail the ocean blue. Oh, we need to get some pepper and salt and whatnot. And then when it comes to the chili pepper, Americans have always been entranced by it, but also scared by it. So they're like, oh my gosh, like it's gonna kill us. In fact, the very first write-ups of Mexican food in the United States, they were negative. They were from scouts who were going across what's now the American Southwest during the Texan War for Independence and also before the Mexican-American War. They would write these dispatches and would say, what was it? Oh, okay. That after the Texan War, after one battle, that the vultures or buzzards, they wouldn't eat the corpses of dead Mexican soldiers because Mexicans eat chili pepper, and if those vultures would eat the corpses, they would die, because their flesh was so spicy and so filled with peppers that they would die. Then later on, all like through the 1850s, 1860s, you still had this urban legend that if you in Texas, wherever there was the corpses of dead Mexicans, you shouldn't have your cows eat on the grass there because that chili pepper, it's still there and the cows are going to eat it and they're going to die. So part of that, it's like they've always known that about Mexican food, that it's super spicy. So that masochistic tendency in our culture, you want to eat the spiciest, hottest thing alive. That's where you have your chili contest. Chili with beans, or no, not with beans. Don't talk to Texans about that. But chili cook-offs and so forth. But at the same time, again, Americans, when it comes to Mexican food, they don't just eat what's in front of them, and they just won't. They won't just accept it. They always want something more. That's one thing that, as critics of fast food Mexican, they've never gotten about the American palate. That the American palate is much more refined than we'll give them credit for. Americans used to eat something called taco sauce. Taco sauce is basically tomato paste with vinegar and a little bit of chili. It's pretty disgusting. You should not eat taco sauce. But Americans ate that for decades and decades until other consumer or other marketers, or rather other producers, started making better hot sauce. Tapatio, Cholula, and onwards. And those became multi-million-dollar empires as well. And you taste Tapatio, it's not going to fry you. Mm-hmm. It has a certain flavor to it. And then on top of that, then you skip over to actual fresh produced salsas. Freshly made salsas. Go to Trader Joe's, go to Whole Foods. You have whole aisles full of these really tasteful salsas. So again, on one part, Americans do want to get fried by Mexican food, but on the other hand, you also want the best possible experience imaginable. And that's the great thing about Mexican food, is that you have that whole panoply of experiences all within this one cuisine.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up the tapatio, and one of the first questions I get, and you touch upon this in your book a little bit, is about the charro, who's on the front of the bottle, and I always get the question, why does he have blue eyes?
They give him tapatio, of course, this amazing hot sauce, and we all know it here in Southern California. It's a little Mexican with a massive sombrero with a smile, and yes, he has blue eyes. And the reason he has blue eyes, it's in regards to the word tapatio. Tapatio refers to somebody. It's a nickname for somebody from the city of Guadalajara in Jalisco. I like to describe Jalisco as the Texas of Mexico. It's this place it's a really great place, but the people there, they think a little bit too highly of themselves. But at the same time, they have that right to do that. Jalisco is the birthplace of tequila. Jalisco is the birthplace of mariachi. And as it so happens to be, Jalisco is also a place where you have a lot of very light-skinned Mexicans with blue eyes and blonde hair. So a lot of people say, oh, typical Mexicans always trying to scrub off their brown skin. But you talk to the founders of Tapatio, who actually come from Mexico City, but they spent a couple of years in Jalisco. They said, well, no, this is how the people from Jalisco look like. So we're just depicting what's truthful.
Right.
But and of course, and Americans are like, Mexicans don't have blue eyes. So silly. So silly.
I did notice I'm married into a Mexican family, and I do notice that the way that Americans use tapatio compared to the way a lot of Mexicans use it. In my wife's family, they just use it to put on their popcorn or maybe on some sort of a potato chip, but not necessarily as a salsa that you would put on like tacos or anything else. Has that been your experience as well? Or?
Absolutely. For Mexicans, hot sauce, it's really a condiment to use on snacks. So, of course, on Doritos and Fritos, and now you have Tapatio flavored Doritos and Fritos. And what do Mexicans do? They put Tapatio on those Tapatio flavored Doritos and Fritos. And popcorn, just little snacks. But the great thing with a Mexican family, usually you have somebody there who knows how to make salsa. And let's face it, salsa is much more tastier than hot sauce. The reason why the founder of Tapatio created Tapatio in the first place was because he couldn't bring his salsa to work because they said, oh, it's not in a bottle, so it's unsanitary. Mm-hmm. So he needed to create something that he could package in a bottle, and so he made Tapatio. So, and of course, some Americans do know how to make salsa, but most Americans don't. So they'll just go what's at the store, and they'll just get Tapatio and pour it. Hey, Tapatio is great. It's my favorite hot sauce right now, though, it's Gringo Bandito. Gringo Bandito is a hot sauce made by Dexter Holland of The Offspring, the famous punk band. And I kid you, I'll tell you the story of Gringo Bandito. The first time somebody gave me a bottle of Gringo Bandito, it has Dexter, just like the Charo in Tapatio. So imagine, big old sombrero, big old that, but instead of a Mexican, it's Dexter Holland, blonde hair punker with sunglasses going like this with guns. Somebody gave me the bottle, I threw it in the trash can immediately. It was dumb Americans thinking they could steal Mexican food. But then I became smart, I got smart, so about 20 minutes later, I fished it out of the trash can, I opened it, and it's great hot sauce. You have to have it here at Google. It's an amazing hot sauce. I would dare say it's better than Tapatio.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
It is a very bold statement. I'll stand by it.
You touched upon tequila. That's a huge moneymaker. And I know that there's specific limitations on where it's produced, how it's produced, and and other things about how you can call it tequila. Can you touch upon that a little bit? And again, how come a lot of the other Mexican spirits didn't take off? Like the mezcal and the tepache and stuff like that.
I love tepache. Tepache is this fermented pineapple drink that's cut with brown sugar. It's absolutely amazing. You have to. You can only find it here locally at Mexico City style restaurants, but you have to try it. It's absolutely good. In my book, there's a whole chapter devoted to Mexican alcohol, and the reason tequila took off the way it did, again, it's going back to that Jalisco myth. Why did Mexico has so many musical traditions. Why is it that mariachi got associated with Mexico more than any? It's because there was a concerted effort in the 1930s in Mexico with the Mexican government when they were basically branding themselves to the rest of the world. They made a conscious effort that we're going to use most of the culture of Jalisco because in their mind, people from Jalisco, they never intermarried with Indians. They were all proud Catholic capitalists, which not necessarily true, but those were the myths that created. So that's why tequila exploded the way it did. Of course, the Mexican government and the tequila producers in Jalisco, or more than just tequila producers, period, they're very, very zealous. Or no, zealous isn't really the right word, but they're very protective of tequila. So technically, it can't be called tequila unless it's made in 5 states in Mexico: in Guanajuato, in Tamaulipas, in, I think, Nuevo León?
Nuevo León.
Nuevo León, and then another one that I can't remember, but 90% of them are made in Jalisco, which is the birthplace of Jalisco, or the birthplace of tequila. Tequila is great, don't get me wrong, I love it, but as you noted, that came at the expense of so many other Mexican alcohols. It's interesting that you mentioned mezcal, because if you go to the more popular hipster bars right now, you're starting to see this influx of mezcal. Mezcal is basically the angrier cousin of tequila. It's made the exact same way, except mezcal is distilled once, and tequila is distilled at least twice. And so mezcal is much smokier. I think it's better than tequila, frankly. So that's just taking off. But mezcal, the first famous Mexican restaurant in the United States was a pop-up restaurant operated by Buffalo Bill of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And on his menu, he was serving mezcal in 1886 in New York City. So hipsters who think, oh, I created something, Buffalo Bill beat you more than a century ago. But other great alcohols, sotol. Sotol is this, oh my God, I can't even describe it, but it's this amazing liqueur, or not liqueur, it's amazing alcohol from Chihuahua basically made from like this dry shrub from the desert of Chihuahua. There's one I think that'll never take off, pulque. Pulque is one of the oldest alcohols known to man. That's made by fermenting the sap of the maguey plant where tequila comes from. And I don't think it'll ever take off because it's basically like drinking alcoholic spit. Very frothy. It's really good. It's an acquired taste. It's very frothy, but it's never going to take off. Then again, I guarantee you, if not this year, but next, you'll start seeing pulquerias or some pulque up here in the United States at the hipster bars.
That's amazing. Also hand in hand with drinking tequila, like you mentioned, is mariachi music, and growing up in kitchens myself, listening to La Nueva and K-Love and then going home and watching novelas. That's how I learned Spanish, and I learned it in a very kind of rude way, And when I married into the Mexican family, I was very, very timid about speaking Spanish to, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law. But they were just happy that I was trying, you touch in your book and mention how a big attitude of Americans is like, how come they're not learning how to speak English, and to where back in the day with the immigrants would definitely learn how to speak English and try to get the accent down, and now it seems to be almost the opposite. It's like we want to know how to speak Spanish the right way and all the cool words and stuff like that. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I talk about that a lot in my Ask a Mexican book, this idea that somehow Mexicans, they never assimilate into the United States, that the only part of Mexicans that assimilate into the United States is food, because Americans love Mexican food. They might not like Mexicans all the time, but they love their Mexican food. But that's false. I mean, that's demonstrably false. I'm the child of Mexican immigrants. In my bio, my dad came to this country in the trunk of a Chevy in 1968, and that was the first time he came here illegally. He knows how to speak English, but he lives his entire life in Spanish. I'd say 95% of the time he's speaking in Spanish, although he'll only speak English if he absolutely has to, which most of the times he doesn't have to. The first language I spoke when I entered kindergarten was Spanish, and now I'm bilingual, but I prefer English over Spanish, and I'll only speak Spanish if I have to. And I want my children, if I ever have children, I want my children to speak Spanish, but I know they're all going to speak English, and they'll probably have a name like Brittany or Jonathan or something like that. Right. But that's the great thing about modern day America, is that in the past, you might have had really that nasty xenophobia where people would be made fun of if you can't speak one language or another. But nowadays, at least people of our generation, we're cool. Like, if your parents don't speak English, that's fine. In fact, you want to learn that other language. Like me, I'm in Orange County. I've learned just cobbling together bits and pieces, a little bit of Vietnamese. I've learned how to read Korean. I don't know what it means, but I know how to read like the Hangul, the Hangul script. I want to learn Arabic. I think it's perfectly fine. And so, and more and more people are starting to become like that. We're in you guys know this at Google especially, we're in a global society. This day of like borders, of cultural borders just closing and never opening, they're done, and we're for the better.
Yeah, and in the news recently, they've come out with some stats saying that now the Asian population is now the largest immigrant movement, even more than the Latino movement. So I find that very interesting. And
oh yeah, that's awesome. And the great thing with immigrant culture in this country, you have all these hybrids. Today we had Dos Chinos. Dos Chinos was created by two Vietnamese guys. They're not Chinos, but they grew up in Santa Ana, which is a very Mexican city, and so they grew up their entire lives with Mexicans calling them Chinitos, because of course for Mexicans, no other Asians exist except Chinese. It doesn't matter if you're Laotian, Hmong, Thai, you're Chinito. So instead of being all bitter about that, they're like, hey, we're Vietnamese, but we're also Mexican, and we're also American, so we're going to create this food truck, and we're just going to put all those combos together. And so you see their menu, it's tacos and burritos, but it has like Thai fillings, Korean fillings. They just create, and the great thing about them, they name it, they check basically check off all the Asian enclaves of Orange County. So when they're talking about the Bolsa pork, that's referring to Bolsa Avenue, the heart of Little Saigon. When they're talking about Irvine, it's their Irvine Chipotle pork. Irvine, we have a huge Chinese population there, so they're referring to Chinese, like Chinese-style roast pork. Korean taco, Garden Grove tacos. That's the huge Korean population in Garden Grove. And when they have their lunch trucks set up, you have everyone going in there, Asians and Mexicans, and everyone's getting along, and under the auspices of great Mexican food.
How do you think that the gourmet taco truck scene has really affected the original loncheras, and have they brought more of a spotlight to them, or have they kind of pushed them out of the way?
What's happened? I mean, I have my own criticisms of what some people call the gourmet food truck, what I call Lux Lonchera scenes. Some people might criticize them, but I think it's actually been the opposite. What these food trucks have done is legitimize the traditional loncheras. And it's unfortunate that sometimes it has to be that way, but at the same time it's great. So, of course, here in Southern California, we've had food trucks in one way or another since the 1880s, Mexican food trucks. The first food trucks, they were tamale carts. They would be these tamale vendors who would get their horse on a wagon, go all across Southern California, set up their shop at the end of the day, and just start selling tamales. If you read the news accounts from like the 1890s and 1900s in Los Angeles Times, it reads exactly like news accounts of these food trucks today. Wow, there's all these food trucks and the lines are long, but don't eat at some of them because they're really nasty, and they're roach coaches and so forth. So we've always had Americans just in general, but specifically in Southern California, there's always been that bifurcated response where one part of the population didn't want to eat at them, but they always were popular because eventually people realized this is great food. So what's happened with these gourmet food trucks is that they basically showed Americans, look, you could have great food out of a food truck and it'll be perfectly fine. So these traditional loncheras, they're not losing their customers at all. If anything, they're gaining more customers now. There's this amazing food truck in Santa Ana on the corner of Main and Cubbon. It's called Alebrijes. Just use your Google Maps, of course. Just go Main and Cubbon, Santa Ana, California. And you get there, you'll see this humongous pink food truck. It's pink, like Cadillac pink. And now half of the customers is his traditional Mexican working class base. The other half is everyone else who, over the years, they've discovered, like, this is an amazing food truck. He's become and this guy's an immigrant from Guanajuato in Mexico, and he's become so successful that now he has 3 of these food trucks coming along. Again, eventually, what happens with Mexican food in this country, eventually gets mainstreamed, and then people, once they realize, hey, this is great food, my neighbors are eating it, why shouldn't I? Then they go and start digging in for more.
Right. And like you mentioned, the tamale, that was, the original food, from the history of Mexican cuisine that, instead of like tortillas and stuff, it could travel. And so that's why, a lot of people carried it with them, and it was, a very popular food source. One of my favorite books is called Food History in Mexico, and it talks about, the staples, the food staples of the pre-Hispanic, era. And, it was basically, corn, beans, squash, and
cactus.
And cactus. And then, the Spanish came in and introduced, dairy and cows and sheep and goats and stuff like that. What is your take on like how that's evolved, and more specifically about mole, and how mole came in through the Moors in Spain, and then brought all those spices and everything, and kind of made this hodgepodge of flavors, and which is now one of the most famous dishes from Mexico.
What we consider to be quote unquote Mexican food, even quote unquote authentic Mexican food, by definition is inauthentic. And that's so talking about Mexican food. That's just another bullet in the arguments of people who have this authenticity debate. Because what we know as Mexican food, it's a combination of everything. As you pointed out, corn, squash, beans, cactus. That's been part of, and chili peppers and tomatoes. That's been part of Mexican food since the Aztecs, since the Mayans, since the Olmecs. But everything else that we consider Mexican food, carne asada, al pastor, tequila, that only came into being because the Spaniards came in and brought in the sheep and the pork and the chickens and the dairy and the distillation that created all of those dishes. All those great Mexican beers, Corona, well, maybe not Corona, Tecate, Bohemia, for instance. You see those labels and you read the names, you wonder, Bohemia beer, I wonder who made that. It was Czech, German, and Austrian immigrants who came in during the 1880s, 1890s, and they created their Mexican brews. From the Middle East, you have the Moors who introduced to the Spaniards rice, who then brought it to the New World. Al Pastor came from Lebanese immigrants who were sheep herders. Al Pastor refers to sheep herder style or shepherd style. And they brought it to central Mexico during the turn of the 20th century. So all these traditions all get mixed up into what's Mexican food. One of the great ones, of course, mole. Mole being this impossibly rich, I guess technically you would call it a stew, I think.
Yeah, the cooking method would be along the line.
Yeah, like a cooking method, just impossibly rich sauce. And every state in Mexico has their own traditions. And that, of course, depending on what the tradition is, it's going to have other influences. Some of the best moles, they have pomegranate, which we call granada, that came, again, from Spain, from the Middle East. Oranges come from the Middle East. So I think it's wonderful. I think that's why Mexican food has been able to travel as far as it has, because it morphs into whatever the regional traditions are. Here in Southern California, right now we're all gaga over the Korean taco, as Kogi, Korean barbecue, famously made. But before that, the big ethnic fusion was something called the kosher burrito, which we now know as the pastrami burrito. The pastrami burrito came from East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights during the 1950s, because then Jews lived alongside Latinos. Jews like pastrami, Latinos like burritos. They both like each other's food. Voila, the pastrami burrito. So it's that mezcla. We call it in Mexico mestizaje, that mixing and matching of all that. That's what makes food as great as it is. And as a chef, you know that if you cook the same dish again and again and again and again, people are going to get bored of it. Humans, when it comes to food, yeah, we want to be satiated, we want to be well off nutritionally, but we also want our palate to dance. And Mexican food, it's the perfect way to do it.
What is the street food scene like in Mexico City?
Mexico City is one of the great cuisine, or one of the great food destinations in the world. Mexico City and Tijuana. Mexico City, you basically have all these stalls and a million, what do you call it? A million manifestations of masa. Yeah, I'm trying to be alliterative here. So basically you have not just tacos, you're gonna have not just sopes, which you better get after this talk, you better get the sopes at the kitchen right now, but also you have huaraches, you have something called mulitas, which is half gordita, half quesadilla. You have something called the tlacoyo, which is basically an elongated gordita with fava beans inside of it. You have quesadillas that are as long as my forearm. Absolutely magnificent. But since you guys are here in Southern California, the place to go eat right now is Tijuana. Don't believe what the media says about all these narco wars happening in Tijuana. Right now, the Tijuana food scene is one of the best food scenes in the world. In fact, for the shameless plug, for the OC Weekly, we have a column called Tijuana Sea. Every Thursday, we review a new place in Baja California where you have to go eat Mexican food. According to my food critic, they have the best olive oil in the world right now in Baja California. You have amazing seafood. You have amazing tacos going all over the place. It's a place where consider it a day trip. Go down there. It's a 2.5 hour drive. Spend a day there just gorging yourself. That's a place where you could go on a winery estate and get a 10-course meal for $50. That's the place to go right now.
Does it get your hide when people pronounce it Tijuana?
Tijuana. Just like here in Long Beach, you call it what? Juan Perro, or instead of Junipero or whatever. As long as people try, it's okay. People sometimes mispronounce my name, like Arellano or whatever. It's okay. I tell them, well, this is how you pronounce it, but that's fine. As long as it's done with no malice, that's fine. But if you're doing it on purpose, then the fist.
Talking about masa, and how important was, corn, originally in the Mexican society. I mean, it was cultivated from something that looked like a wheat, and they grew and cultivated it and, dedicated. I mean, they had Xilonen, which is the goddess of corn. I actually have a holy corn tattoo on my hand.
Right on his thumb.
How
That's cool.
important is corn to the Mexican culture?
Next to the Virgin of Guadalupe, corn is the most important thing in Mexican society. You wouldn't have Mexico or a Mexican people without corn. More specifically than corn, though, is masa and the invention that connects corn when you harvest corn, turning it into masa, is something called nixtamalación, which is essentially you get these corn kernels, you let it sit in a live foundation along with ash, and then all of this, and then you let it ferment. Some of the most important food discoveries have come from people just letting food rot. Because if you eat corn that's unprocessed again and again and again, you're going to get poisoned. You're going to get poisoned with something called pellagra. But the process of nixtamalación, what that does, it takes out the poisons from the corn kernels, and also it releases from each corn kernel niacin and all this other nutritional value that was locked there before. So nixtamalación, and then from there you could mix up the corn and make masa, and from masa, of course, you get tortillas and tamales. Corn in the Virgin Guadalupe, that is Mexico. Without those two, you would not have Mexico.
Right. I've noticed that not only in Mexico, but in other countries, India, for example, that a lot of the population who live in the south are they have less money than people who live in the north, and so the food is very, very different from the south to the north. And like in Mexico, it's in the north, in like Chihuahua and the Charros and everything, they it's basically a protein-based meal, lots of protein.
Yeah.
And in the South, where there's not a lot of money for proteins and stuff, they're using nuts and chilies and spices and other things to kind of make these meals. I've noticed that. Do you have any?
Oh yeah, a lot of Americans historically they thought Mexican food is tacos, burritos, enchiladas, just very limited. But Mexico, like the United States, each region has its own traditions. If you go down all the way south to Oaxaca, to one of the southernmost states in Mexico, they're eating grasshoppers. They dry grasshoppers, they put some salt, chili, and lime, and they pop them like popcorn. It's really good. They're really, really good. And their tortillas, they're as big as basketball hoops, and they're called tlayudas. But then you go up to northern Mexico, it's beef. Beef is king there. Cheese, not yellow cheese, not processed cheese, but queso menonita made by Mennonite colonies in Chihuahua. Seafood in Baja California, of course, because you're right next to the Sea of Cortez. Mexico City, you have all this great street food. My parents were from Zacatecas, so there we like the stew called birria. Birria is a goat stew, except we make it with beef. We call it birria de res, and we love gorditas, and we love cactus. One question I was getting asked a Mexican, how can Mexicans eat cactus? Don't the spines prick them? And I tell them, no, we take them off, but cactus is really, really good. So yeah, and that's a great thing with Mexican food right now in the United States. You have Mexican immigrants from all over Mexico now. Historically, most Mexican migration came from central Mexico, from Michoacan, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Mexico City, Sonora also. So what we consider Mexican food, those are really the traditions of those regions. Tacos, burritos from northern Mexico, carne asada from northern Mexico, machaca, Sonora. Those are the traditions that historically came to the United States because those were the Mexicans that were coming. Now that we have Mexicans from everywhere, we can taste all these different traditions, especially here in Los Angeles. You have such a great food scene here with Mexico.
Yeah. I know in Chicago is probably the second largest Mexican population in the country, and then Los Angeles. And it seems that, like in Chicago, a lot of Mexicans from Michoacan have settled up there, and a lot of the Mexicans here in Southern California are from Oaxaca.
Yeah.
And I've worked with a ton of Oaxacan guys in the kitchen, and by far they are the hardest, most dedicated working group of people from Mexico,
Yeah.
And yet they get ridiculed a lot, because of their stature and stuff. Have you noticed any kind of? Has anyone ever asked you about that in your column?
Oh, sure. And actually in the book, I talk about this famous restaurant here in Los Angeles called Guelaguetza. They're the most famous Oaxacan restaurant in the United States. And Oaxacan cuisine is acknowledged as the best Mexican food from Mexico. That restaurant's, I think next year they're going to celebrate, 94, they're going to celebrate their 20th anniversary. When they first opened here in Los Angeles, no one would eat at this place except two types of people. Oaxacans who wanted a taste of home, and their who worked here, who lived here in Santa Monica and the West Side, because a lot of these Oaxacans, they worked in the kitchen, they worked as nannies, they worked as janitors, they worked as gardeners, and so they would bring their food to their bosses and say, hey, there's this great Oaxacan restaurant, you could eat the food of my homeland down in Koreatown. So the founder of Guelaguetza, or the owner of Guelaguetza, Fernando Lopez, he told me the story for my book, that he would be just bewildered His tiny little restaurant was in Koreatown when it was sketchier than it was today, and he would just see this parade of BMWs and Audis and Mercedes and wondered, like, why are these people coming to my restaurant? And they were the bosses. So those were the only two people who wanted to eat there. Americans weren't going to eat guelaguetza because they still didn't know what Oaxacan food was. And Mexicans were not going to eat guelaguetza because for them, Oaxacans were just dirty Indians. Because the state of Oaxaca has always been different from the rest of Mexico. Number one, because there's a mountain range that basically isolates it from the rest of Mexico, and as a result, they've kept on to their indigenous traditions. So a lot of Oaxacans are darker skinned, they're in shorter stature. A lot of them, their first language isn't even Spanish, it's whatever their indigenous language is. Zapoteco or Triqui or Mixtec or whatever. And so they get made fun of in the rest of Mexico. So again, this authenticity debate, these Mexicans, they didn't think Oaxacan food was authentically Mexican, which is such bull. And to me, that just shows that a God does exist and he has a great sense of humor, because now Oaxacan food, everyone knows Oaxacan food is the best Mexican food in Mexico and in the rest of the world. And yeah, Oaxacans are some of the hardest working people and the greatest people you'll ever meet.
Yeah, and I really credit guys or chefs like Diana Kennedy and Rick Bayless and the Two Hot Tamales,
Yeah.
and they really took Oaxacan cuisine, because I think it was so different from what they originally understood, and brought it to the forefront and put it in their books and put it on their television stations. What do you think of chefs like that, or like Rick Bayless, who is a white boy from Oklahoma, worked in his parents' barbecue spot, and then really just fell in love with Mexico and everything Mexican, and now he is basically the leader and forefront of Mexican cuisine.
Yeah, he just got an award from the Mexican government for his contributions to Mexican food, or to the promotion of Mexican food. I have my problems with Rick Bayless, but only because of this incident that happened between me, him, and Jonathan Gold, the Pulitzer Prize winning food critic, where he essentially called Jonathan Gold a liar because we both criticized him for him insisting that there was he was coming into he was going to create this restaurant, consult in a restaurant here in Southern California called Retta, where he was going to say, I'm going to bring the real flavors of Mexico to Southern California. And we're like, really, Rick? You're really going to introduce Mexican food to Southern California? Come on, you're a little bit full of yourself. All that said, I've been to Frontera and Topolobampo. They're great foods, or they're great restaurants. He is a great promoter of Mexico. I'm never going to hold it against him because he's a white man who's promoting Mexican food. A lot of people do have that problem against him. That's not my problem at all. And same thing, with the other great ambassadors, Diana Kennedy, who also believes in this authenticity thing, the Two Hot Tamales, Mary Sue Milliken, and Susan Feniger. They're all promoters in their own, very strong promoters of Mexican food. America needs those ambassadors. I mean, really, this is sad to say, but it's true. Americans are more likely to pay attention to what a white person's going to say about Mexican food than they would a Mexican chef who doesn't know how to speak English. It's just a reality. Are you going to hold it against Kennedy and Bayless and the Two Hot Tamales? I'm not. And frankly, it's racist to hold it against them. I mean, that's what, you can have your criticisms of people for their business practices or their pronunciations. Like Diana Kennedy, for instance, despises Tex-Mex food. She basically calls it glop, which I think it's elitist in its own way. I'll criticize her on that, but the fact that she's a British woman who loves Mexico and has done more to, promote these regional traditions and other folks, I'm not going to hold that against her at all. And more importantly, again, for me, it boils down to the food. Kennedy never opened her own restaurant, but Bayless did. Great food. Never ate at Reto, though. Frontera Border Grill. I love that place. Too crowded for me most of the times, but I love it.
Yeah, and, Diana Kennedy was very specific on, you eat this on this day, and you serve it like this, and really, like you said, it's a great educational tool, because otherwise I would have never known those traditions, unless she wrote about them.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, I thank you very, very much. I'd like to open the floor up to anyone who has a question for Gustavo.
Don't be shy. Yeah, and if you could go up to the mic so the people at home could listen.
How has the availability of produce and other ingredients, and actually particularly food regulations, how has that affected Mexican food in America?
Only until very recently, a lot of Mexican food in this country was made in a certain way because you didn't have all the ingredients that you had in Mexico. So, for instance, chili powder. Chili powder was actually created by a German immigrant by the name of William Gebhardt, who wanted to make his chili with Mexican chili peppers, but he'd have to go all the way down to Mexico in the 1880s. So instead of doing that, he's like, instead I'll just buy all those chilies and they'll rot on the way. Instead, I'll just create chili powder, and it's not going to be the same flavor. It's not going to be the exact same flavor, but I'll still get those instances. Same thing with yellow cheese. A lot of people hate yellow cheese. They're like, that's not real Mexican food if it's covered with yellow cheese. Mexicans don't eat yellow cheese. Historically, no, but I wasn't the one who did this research. It was actually Rob Walsh, who's the dean of Tex-Mex, the dean of Texan cooking, of food historians. And so he interviewed these chefs in Texas, who go back to the 40s and 30s, and he asked them, why do you use yellow cheese? Why did you guys use yellow cheese instead of white cheese? And he said, well, because we followed what our customers wanted. They didn't want white cheese. They wanted something that melted, and yellow cheese has a faster melting point than white cheese does. And so as a result, that changed the food. Again, that said though, anybody who thinks that food should stay in a bubble, they're deluded, because that's not how food has ever operated. Why do we eat a lot of cactus in Zacatecas? Because there's a lot of cactus. If we were in, say, Mexico City, you're not going to find as many cacti there as you would in Zacatecas. So food is always evolving. In the present day nowadays, though, everything has changed, because now you have Mexican produce within a day. If you want, I want this really exotic herb from Veracruz. I'll just go to my local Mexican market. Who's getting it now? Like, now there are no borders. Now you can cook just like Mexicans do in Mexico using their ingredients. Anyone could do that now. I mean, some people still say, oh, well, you didn't make it in Mexico, so it's the water. But it's like that debate that Guinness tastes different in Ireland than it does here in the United States. Then you do a blind taste test and no one can tell the difference. Myths, a lot of myths.
New York pizza.
New York pizza too.
And you wouldn't say that regulation has affected much?
Well, regulation has historically played a big role also in Mexican food. In a bad way, in the sense that you can't get some foodstuffs. Like, for instance, if you you could only take over so many wheels of Mexican cheese right now across the border, I think you have to declare 3, and then after that, you could only take like 10, and you have to pay a tariff on it. So it does limit some of the foodstuffs. But again, what do Mexicans do? You just you get a whole bunch of them, hundreds of these wheels, and then you pay people, hey, be my cheese smuggler across the border. We do that, so. Or what happens if you have all this regulation, then an underground economy starts up. I actually just wrote about this for the OC Weekly, how in California, food is so regulated that you can't have what's called, cottage food. In other words, these small batch chefs or producers of food who want to say like they want to make jams and jellies, and they want to, they're not going to make a huge profit off of it, but they do want to sell it like at a craft fair or whatever. Under California law, you cannot do that. You have to cook in a commercially licensed kitchen. You have to get these permits, this, and that. Mexicans, we've never paid attention to that. So we've been buying food and chorizo from people who make it out of their own homes for decades. And so then people will say like, oh, can't you get poisoned off of it? Well, here I am, and look at me, I'm perfectly fine.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So actually, there's a bill in committee on the cottage industry.
Yes.
Yeah, you know about it.
Absolutely.
I don't know the number, but so I was going to say I'm a native Californian, and other than several episodes with chilies, Mexican food has really only brought tears to my eyes twice. Once was when I left in the late 90s to go to the Midwest to go to graduate school, and I went to Chi-Chi's. That brought tears to my eyes, and I thought it's going to be a long, dark time away from really good quality fresh food. The other was when I came back to California and went to a Oaxacan restaurant in Santa Monica. I don't remember the name of it, but it was amazing. And I just thought, wow, it's not just generic Mexican food, but it's really, really good Mexican food. So.
Yeah, thank you. Really quickly, Chi-Chi's was a competitor to El Torito during the 1970s and 80s. And it came from a guy from Minnesota. And you might wonder, like, what do Minnesotans know about Mexican food? Well, they know a little bit, but not chichis. First of all, the name, which of course is a Spanish slang for a woman's breast. Like, no way on earth could a Mexican restaurant succeed with a name like that in California, and it didn't. So that's why it proliferated in the Midwest and the East Coast. Now it no longer exists because the food was atrocious. And actually, yeah, it was absolutely atrocious food. But that's a great thing about Mexican food. Some people love chichis. Some people love Taco Bell. I can't stand Taco Bell. I've given it so many chances in my life, it's never worked. Del Taco, on the other hand, their burritos, their 99-cent burritos, absolutely amazing for what they are. But Oaxacan food, it's a whole other level. So you could have all these different types of traditions within the panoply of Mexican food.
For chichis, I'm glad that you put it in the book. I was trying to figure out like the marketing concept behind it. I thought, okay, a guy went to Taco Bell and he thought, let's serve alcohol and have people sit down, and there you go, right? Like that's it. And it was awful. And there's probably people who had really good times there, and I feel bad kind of like slamming on it, but
no. Chichis will never be remembered for their food. Where people had the good time was because of all the margaritas that they drank. So during the 1970s, you had Taco Bell and Del Taco and all these other fast food taco chains gaining in popularity and teaching people what Mexican food was or what Mexican food could offer. The next step was these sit-down Mexican restaurants like El Torito, El Coyote here, El Cholo Cafe, those types of restaurants where you have a combo plate, you drink your margaritas, and you eat on the patio. That was a type of Mexican restaurant. Those restaurants have really gone, at least that genre is no longer as popular as they were. Chichis no longer exist. El Torito, their parent company, declared bankruptcy last year. Now there's about 50 of those left. I predict within 10 years they'll be completely gone because people have evolved. Now you're going to go eat that great Oaxacan food. Now you're going to those great food trucks. Now you're going to these hole-in-the-walls. Or you're going to these higher-end Mexican restaurants like Frontera Grill in Chicago or Rivera here in Los Angeles. There's different traditions and different experiences where people can get their Mexican food, or you just cook it at home. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think the frozen margarita is going to go anywhere?
The frozen margarita is not going to go anywhere because in the book I talk about the creation of the frozen margarita machine. So there's always going to be a market for people who just want to get drunk and drunk and frozen as fast as possible. But what's happened though, Americans, they haven't tired of the frozen margarita, but they've realized there's better margaritas. Before there only used to be 2 tequila companies that would sell tequila here in the United States, Sausa and Jose Cuervo. In fact, the reason tequila tastes the way it tastes today was because during the 1960s, you had all these Americans going on vacation to Puerto Vallarta, Acapulco, and they would drink the margaritas there, and then go back home, bring bottles of tequila souvenir gifts, and then they try to drink it. They're like, oh, it's like too harsh. So these companies, they changed the recipe of tequila so it could be more palatable to the American palate. Now you have hundreds of tequilas. My God, you have Michael Imperioli doing these horrible commercials for 1800 tequila, like Spider from Goodfellas knows what good tequila is about. So there's always going to be different levels of Mexican food, and I think that's a great thing.
I really like menudo, and one time when I was in Mexico, I had a white menudo. I haven't been able to find it here. Do you know where I could find that?
Yeah, I laugh because it's amazing the fights people will get in over food. And so here I'm thinking of Mexican food. So in Arizona, white menudo, that's actually, that's a tradition. You have white menudo or pozole. So Andrew Zimmern of Bizarre Foods, he went to Tucson and he didn't like the white menudo. He basically nearly started a riot for telling people like, I don't like white menudo. Oh my gosh, how can you not like it? Where can you find white menudo? You are gonna have to find regional restaurants. One example, I wonder if you guys have them here in Los Angeles. I don't think you do, but you would try to go to restaurants that serve the cuisine of Guerrero, the Mexican state of Guerrero. In Santa Ana, there's a place called El Fogon, which is basically, El Fogon, F-O-G-O-N. It's off of Edinger and Standard. Edinger? Yes, Edinger and Standard in Santa Ana. El Fogon's really good. So they serve red menudo, white menudo, and green menudo. Green menudo is the best menudo of them all. It's absolutely amazing. So, but yeah, white menudo, you'll find it at households, but in terms of restaurants, they're few and far in between because that's that red menudo that's much more popular. The reason being is because that's more a tradition of Jalisco which again governed most of what we know as Mexican food, and still does to a certain extent in this country. But go to Tucson, white menudo all over the place.
Gustavo, so you talk about, I think I agree with you that food and cultural borders there are no borders. It's very, we mix a lot and it's a great thing. So what do you think about our country's constant efforts to actually build a border? And then the recent legislation, especially in states like Arizona or Louisiana or Alabama, where it's actually quite scary to be a Mexican in those states. And then President Obama just signing the DREAM Act last week.
Ooh, so political and so many questions. Starting off with Obama, what Obama did in terms of basically allowing undocumented youth, in other words, people who came to this country illegally when they were children, and not making them citizens, but making sure that they don't get deported. It was a political ploy. I mean, kudos for him for doing that, but it's all politics, because he was getting criticized so much by Latino activists on it, and he's going to be in a very tough election. So he decided, okay, I'm going to say this. They're not going to be citizens, but Latinos will support me now. So it's purely political. Whatever. I'm still voting for Alfred E. Newman in the fall election. That's number one. When it comes to all this proposed all this anti-immigrant legislation, this country, it's an amazing country. I love this country, but we've always had this xenophobic streak in our minds that gets disproven again and again and again. One of my all-time favorite questions for Ask a Mexican, somebody asked me, actually, why don't Mexicans learn how to speak English? Why don't they assimilate? Blah, blah, blah. So then I said, you know what? The United States government shares your concern. They just created this new study that's showing that this new wave of immigrants, that they're absolutely dumb, that they don't assimilate, that all they want to do is make money and send it back home. And we should really just clamp down on these borders and not allow these immigrants. And they're not like the immigrants of the past that were absolutely awesome and did it the right way. The problem with that study is that it was written in 1911. It was called the Dillingham Report, and the immigrants at the time were all Southern and Eastern Europeans. Italians, Jews, Czechs, Poles, Greeks, Bulgarians, and the lionized immigrants, the immigrants that did it the right way, were the Swedes, the Germans, the Irish, all those immigrants. And of course, those immigrants were also trashed on. You had Ben Franklin, before there was even a United States, Ben Franklin railing against German immigrants and going to Pennsylvania, saying he used this really nasty. It's not a curse word now, but it's like this really nasty ethnic epithet against these Germans, and saying, within a generation we're all going to speak German because all these Germans they're not assimilating. So of course Mexicans, all immigrants, of course they all immigrate or they all assimilate. And yet at the same time we always have part of our culture. That's why Chinatowns have been around for now 150 years, or Little Italy's and all that. So whenever you try to build borders, or whenever you try to keep a country static, when you don't allow a country to breathe freely and just allow people to mingle, you're really spelling your demise. And again, in this country, we always get proven wrong. So I'm an optimist. We will get proven wrong. All this anti-immigrant legislation, it'll be defeated one way or another, and then we'll move on, and then in 20 years we'll do the same thing again. So we always forget, but our better angels always win eventually. It takes time, but eventually we do.
Well, hopefully food will help us all get along.
And what's the one language we all speak here in Southern California? Mexican food. What's the one part of Mexican society that Americans have accepted? Mexican food. And that's really the great that's a great indicator that yes, Mexicans will eventually, be fully considered Americans, or blah 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 blah, because Americans already love their Mexican food. They always have and they always will, and that's a good thing. That is absolutely a good thing.
Last comment. I just read your most recent Ask a Mexican question, and the question is, are a lot of Mexicans going to Canada now?
Oh, yeah.
And I just want to say, no, stay here. We love your food and we love the people.
Yeah, more Mexicans are starting to go to Canada because of that. First of all, there's no jobs here right now in Canada. It's a boom time, and Canadians are so damn nice. Of course, we want to go up to Canada. One of the weird things in my column, it has a big Canadian audience. And so I get a lot of questions from Canadians, and one question that I've been asked more than any from those Canadians, they always go, us Canadians, we're nice. You Mexicans, you're nice. Those Americans, they're a bunch of jerks. Why don't we get our countries together and take over the United States? And these aren't just random people. It's a question that, or a concerted effort by these Canadians. This has been asked of me again and again and again. And Americans are nice. Again, we go through our fits, our growing pains, but we do grow out of it. So I'm always an optimist. Again, when it comes to food, that shows the path, that shows the way. Everyone will love us one way or another. And no, we're not going anywhere. Trust me, we're not going anywhere.
Gustavo, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all. And then I guess, yeah, I'll be over at that table. If you guys want me to sign your books, I'm more than happy to. And again, thank you so much for being able to be here. And I hope you guys like the dos chinos because they're one of my favorite food.